Greetings, friends of liberty. 'Twas not a week ago that I was again contemplating a most peculiar fact. Did you realize that the ancient period of the Greek Enlightenment, that extraordinary outpouring of philosophy, science, and art from about the 6th to 3rd century BC, that stretched from Asia Minor and the Ionian Enlightenment of Thales, Heraclitus, and Anaximander, to Athens and the rise of the contrarian and disputatious sophists, to Socrates and Plato's Academy, to Aristotle and his Lyceum? Did you realize that that enlightenment had something very much in common with ours, here in England and Europe? Here's a clue. How have the individuals who've been the most enlightened been educated? So, for example, when we think of all those American statesmen like Washington and the Washingtons and Jeffersons and Adamses and Monroes and Madisons and Masons and Henrys and Randolphs, who were only recently British and who have just established perhaps the freest commonwealth on earth, how were they educated? I shall tell you. By being taught or tutored by private teachers in their own homes, and then on to private schools or private colleges. And then, upon graduating, more study and dialogue with others. In addition, numerous of the most distinguished, such as Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, and Alexander Hamilton, were largely self-taught. Partly they were by the use of the American newspapers, found and read everywhere. Now, isn't it odd that the Athenians, too, understood the value, as Plato described it in the Protagoras, of their children being overwhelmingly educated at home, or in private schools and by private teachers, in reading, music, drawing, and gymnastics? Students went to school on average from about ages 7 to 14, the length of study varying depending on the income of the parents and the brilliance of the youngster. And so we see that private and home education turned out very well for the Athenians too, with Athenian society being perhaps more literate than any in the ancient world. But if we had turned southwards, past Corinth and down the Peloponnese, the Spartans from the 5th century onwards followed the opposite path, constructing a complete system of state education for everyone. Man, do they have one philosopher, one poet, one scientist or sculptor who can rival the brilliance of the Athenians? No, Sparta represents an intellectual and artistic wasteland, in much the same way that Islam, forbidding literature, painting and music, and the practice of philosophy, has also become an artistic and intellectual wasteland. 'Tis all no accident. Now, if we turn to the issue of the value of private versus public education in your own 20th and 21st centuries throughout the Anglosphere, we find today the work of historian E.G. West and his Education and the State, in which he addresses many of the basic questions we should ask when judging whether the private education that worked so brilliantly for the Athenians and Enlightenment English can work for everyone. West begins by contrasting the rationale for state aid for education from the usual rationale for funding any state action, that the state's proper role should simply be in preventing people's rights from being violated. So we naturally understand using state funds to protect citizens from robbery, assault, or fraud, but to help make children less ignorant, is this also justifiable? He argues that it is to a degree. This is becoming clear if we make a comparison with food. Just as parents have a legal responsibility to feed their children, which if they neglect are culpable, so too the same applies to some amount to education. I would argue personally that the state has the right to A, make sure the parents do everything in their power to educate their children to some minimal standard, B, if the parents consistently refuse at least that minimal standard, to monitor them and if necessary punish them to ensure compliance. And C, if the parents are simply too poor to see that they get whatever charity is available from the private sector to help them educate their children. However, as West importantly notes, parental poverty has often been used not just to justify helping poor individual parents, but to mandate creating an entire universal governmental system. But the parallel with food is obvious. We don't imagine that if a few parents neglect feeding their children, that we should therefore entertain measures which lead to increased taxes to provide children's food free at local authority kitchens or shops for every child. That would prove a complete non sequitur. Another interesting contradiction, inconsistent with the claim that governmental schooling is done for the well-being of the child or achieves it, is that parents are not allowed generally or are restricted in choosing which schools to send their children, they being forced to take schools within the geographic areas they're assigned by the state. But if the authorities really cared about children's education, they would allow children to go to the best public schools, wherever they're located. But overwhelmingly in the UK and US, they can't. That is, unless they live in the US in a school choice state where there is more choice available. And the unfortunate result, as West points out, of this educational zoning is that it simply freezes the system and insulates the authorities from this necessity to improve educational provision. Yet another issue, perhaps most often used to justify public schooling, is that of positive side effects or externalities, what West calls spillover effects. Here, the generic rationale often given by champions of public education is that since education makes kids better citizens, more productive workers, and happier in general, if we then force everyone to go to schools, then we'll maximize all those positive side effects. This argument takes dozens of forms, only limited by the imagination. A typical expression came from the British utilitarian W.T. Thornton in 1846, who said, "No one now denies that proper schools for the lower orders of people ought to be founded and maintained at the cost of the state. The expense, no doubt, would be considerable, but it would scarcely be so great as that already incurred for prisons, hulks, and convict ships. To hold," he meant, "the criminals that otherwise would be produced." Or another version of this argument went, while public education was not indispensable to a monarchical government, it was to a republic, since where every act of the government was an act of the people, it was absolutely necessary that people be enlightened. But is public education the way to do this? Are there more positive side effects to public than private education? No, there are fewer in reality. So as a typical example, as West remarks, in some British schools in terms of juvenile delinquency, the last year of compulsory education was also the heaviest year for juvenile delinquency, and the tendency to crime during school years was reversed when a boy went to work. This result was duplicated again in 2002, cited by Bartholomew, when it was found in London, quite astonishingly, that the proportion of crimes committed by 10 to 16-year-olds during school hours is street robberies 40%, car thefts 33%, burglaries 25%. And why was this? Simply because a boy had more time in his hands to get into mischief when at school compared with when he was at work. So this effect is one of the many negative side effects of public education, which wouldn't occur if kids were forced to be at school, but instead could choose how long to study and then go to work when they wanted. Yet another of dozens of negative net externalities of public education is that, in the U.S., it is strictly secular, which means that all those parents who want to combine a religious education with the 3 R's are harmed. In England, however, the opposite can occur with children forced to listen to a kind of generic, homogenized religious instruction, which is obviously insincere. And this result occurred because in Parliament, there was introduced a clause, which still remains law, stating that no religious catechism or religious formulary distinctive of any denomination is to be taught in any board school. Not surprisingly, Ordinary state school teachers often lack conviction when giving scripture lessons, and young people are the first to detect this. Of course, this problem is solved with private religious education. So too is false the alleged claims that public education raises the prospective income of students who graduate. But there's no reason to think that this happens more in a public system, since dropout rates are higher, the instruction is worse, and the overall cost to society is greater. Similar, too, is the argument often made that more subsidies to education give us more PhDs, which will give us more inventions and scientific discoveries. But, again, there is no proof that subsidizing the production of more PhDs will give us better PhDs this way than if we let them choose freely without the bribe of subsidies. This is, incidentally, exactly why we find a huge glut of professors, often in English, in academia today, who serve no useful purpose. In addition, some of the most inventive periods in American history occurred during the last half of the 19th century, when there was relatively little higher education, and most of it was private anyway. So, given the many negative side effects of public education compared to private, how did English educational reformers in the last half of the 19th century try to justify establishing a huge new national public system around 1870? They did by telling falsehoods, whether intentional or unintentional, in claiming that the private system wasn't doing a good enough job. They focused on two claims in particular: the current degree of literacy and the current quantity of schooling. Let's examine each. There was a certain degree of irony in the British government claiming that literacy wasn't widespread enough, since at the beginning of the 19th century, the state actively fought the spread of literacy because it believed that the average citizen would thereby be exposed to the radical ideas of liberty and natural rights by the likes of Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, or in William Cobbett's newspaper, The Register. And so the British government engaged in the closing down of public reading rooms and the withdrawal of licenses from public houses, inns, and coffee houses. Fortunately, these censorious efforts proved ineffectual, both Thomas Paine and William Cobbett being widely read authors, and it was said that the writings of Cobbett were read on nearly every cottage hearth in the manufacturing districts of South Lancashire. So despite these efforts, what was the degree of literacy? Fairly high, since schools almost always taught children first to read. As West says, ordinary people wanted to read in order to enjoy the new excitements of magazines and newspapers, whereas they did not have quite the same need for writing, and writing materials were expensive because of taxes upon them. Estimates then, looking at the education of criminals, run between 2/3 and 3/4 of the working classes as literate. And by the middle of the 1860s, the proportion was probably near 9/10. A second set of estimates derived from the 1891 census, which show the literacy rates of men leaving school in 1870, show that 93% of men signed the marriage register by writing their name. 93%. That was a free market in action. And more broadly, the influence of the rising per capita wealth of 19th century England, which allowed the more affluent working class to increasingly buy education. So the first claim of the British educational progressives, that public education was needed to increase literacy, was false. Now let's examine the second, that not enough children were being educated or in school when they should have been, perhaps because of the neglect or poverty of the parents who needed them to work as they got older. Fortunately, many reports show how frequently used the private elementary system was in this regard. So, for example, the Newcastle Commission of 1861 found that the vast majority of children received at least some schooling, the average being 5.7 years, which was standard and perfectly adequate in general for the time. As Mr. Winder said, amongst the respectable working class in the towns, absolute neglect is almost unknown, and so much of it as there is may be confined almost exclusively to the lowest of the immigrant Irish, who prefer that their children should beg. Or another report said, there is no large district entirely destitute of schools and requiring to be supplied with them on a large scale, nor is there any large section of the population requiring some special and stringent system of treatment. Or, yet another report, the proportion of children receiving instruction to the whole population is, in our opinion, nearly as high as can be reasonably expected. In Prussia, where it is compulsory, it is 1 in 6.27. In England and Wales, it is 1 in 7.7. In Holland, it is 1 in 8.1. In France, it is 1 in 9.0. But 9 years later, MP William Forster introduced his celebrated Education Bill of 1870. In presenting it, he made hardly any reference to the Newcastle Commission's findings, some of which we've heard here. Instead, he misrepresented the number of children out of school, claiming that at least 25% of the English school population was entirely without efficient schooling. But what he and his statisticians essentially did was to overestimate years that normal children spent in school, claiming about 8 years from ages 5 to 13. But in reality, the average child spent only about 6 years in school from ages 5 to 11, which again was fine for that time. And so Forster, claiming that a much greater number of kids were of school age, the population from 5 to 13, and finding fewer, the actual population from 5 to 11, he claimed that the private sector had allowed a gap of uneducated children to occur. With regard to the city of Liverpool, Forster claimed that there were 80,000 school-aged children, when the correct number of years of schooling being 6 instead of 8, the correct number of students in school should have been 60,000, not 80,000 as he claimed. So there was no gap of 20,000 unschooled Liverpudlians as he'd claimed. But despite these falsehoods, his bill passed anyway. And once it had, since 3/5 of taxation fell on food and tobacco at this time, which the poor would have to pay, the poor were taxed more to pay for their own public education, which they didn't even need because they were already educating themselves. And since this taxation inhibited, the ability of parents to pay for the better value of the private education they were already using, it thus slowly destroyed the market in private education. In addition, the educational authorities would often claim that private schools were inefficient and so forbid them from getting state funds, with the result that, with their advantage of aid, the public board schools could also afford to let their fees drop below those of private schools, which helped them to capture an increasing proportion of an otherwise private school clientele. This effect of the monopoly of public education destroying private was predicted by many. So, for example, MP Henry Brougham had earlier said that the 1,144,000 now educated at unendowed schools will speedily fall down to almost nothing, and the adoption of such a fatal and heedless course will sweep away those establishments which, at present, reflect so much honor on the community and which do so much good. Exactly what happened. Incidentally, I've reviewed 2 books here which show the same effect. The Beautiful Tree by William Tooley, focusing on Africa and the Third World, and Samuel Blumenfeld's Is Public Education Necessary?, which focuses on early 19th century Boston and Massachusetts. And I also reviewed Phil Gardner's The Lost Elementary Schools of Victorian England, which describes this exact process West is describing in Victorian England. And so, to summarize, England destroyed its pound-for-pound comparatively better system of private elementary education, substituting an inferior public system. And what happened subsequently after Forster's Education Bill of 1870? In 1891 and later, with the Fisher Act of 1918, the state finally and definitively abolished fees in elementary schools, resulting in a further deterioration in school quality. In 1901, the board schools were taken over by 350 local authorities, which became responsible for them in the same way that they were responsible for the water supply, roads, and police. And in 1944, the whole English public system was expanded even further. One result of this monopoly was that even parents who wanted to homeschool their children had to fight every step of the way with the administrators of the public schools, and still often were not allowed to do so. And by the 1990s, comprehensive schools, not popular with parents, educated 90% of British students. As a result, they began falling behind students of other countries, with, for example, the average 15-year-old Japanese child better educated at maths and other testable subjects than the top 1/4 of British 16-year-olds, and more than twice as many German 16-year-olds being proficient at O levels. But fortunately, in the years since Thatcher's election in 1980, English parents have achieved more and more control over the education of their children than they previously had, with parents in England and Wales now able to opt out of the current local education system by reorganizing their schools under individual trusts run by managements of parent governors. And by the Assisted Places scheme of 1980, the funds follow the child, which encourages market discipline. Fortunately, the trend in England to greater educational freedom in primary and secondary education has continued, as for example by Michael Gove in 2010 in expanding the number of grant-managed schools and academies which have been a singular success, primarily because these schools are freer to do and teach their children the way they want without state control. In conclusion, I'd give education in the state a B+A-, it now being a bit dated, but nonetheless of considerable value and able to discuss many important issues accurately. Happy now to see the concept of school choice expanding constantly in the United States and also slowly gaining more popularity in England as well. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.